Hello, and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is going to be another book report episode where I talk about a book that I've read recently that I really enjoyed and wanted to share with others. Today's episode is going to be the first time I cover a foreign book. And at this point, unfortunately, this book has not been translated yet into English. But since my podcast focuses so much on both US and Brazilian topics, I thought it was fair to bring up a Brazilian book that is currently only available in Portuguese because there may be listeners who are either native Portuguese speakers or are learning Portuguese and might be interested in reading this book as a result. So today's book report is on a book called Pequena Coreografia do Adeus by a Brazilian author named Aline Bei. She's about my age, and perhaps that is another reason why I identified with this book. And Pequena Coreografia do Adeus translates literally into the little choreography of goodbye. And this is Aline's second book. And this was my first introduction to her as an author. And I bought her book at a bookstore in Fortaleza, in Brazil. And a very common thing in Brazilian bookstores is that books come shrink wrapped. This isn't applicable to all books. So it's not a universal rule, but it is fairly common to see books sold shrink wrapped. So you don't really get a chance to flip through the pages and get a sense of what the book is like prior to buying it. Sometimes with bookstores, they'll have multiple copies that are shrink wrapped, and then they'll have one copy that is not shrink wrapped so you can leaf through. That wasn't the case with this particular book. And so I mentioned that, one, just to bring up this cultural component, that it's a very rare thing to see in the United States. You don't go to bookstores and see books that are shrink wrapped. Much more common practice in Brazil, to preserve the quality of the book. But also because I was surprised once I opened the book to realize that the structure of this book is written like an epic poem, even though I'm not sure. I haven't listened to any interviews with the author to know if she would consider it within that genre, but it is written as a long form poem. And to me, it felt like an epic poem because it is the length of a book and tells this story throughout the course of these various untitled poetic sections. And it's quite beautiful. I really enjoyed this book. And the little the little choreography of goodbye is centered around the story of a young girl whose parents separate, and each of her parents continue to be marked by that separation. And obviously, her as the daughter navigating this is also marked by that. And she suffers abuse as a result. And the book just focuses on what her relationship to her parents, as well as to herself and to the outside world, are as a result of this separation. And I think that Aline does a really beautiful job of describing how that separation is never ending. And of course, there is a moment in time where, in this particular case, right, the marriage is over. Her family of three is now longer one unit. She lives primarily with her mom and then goes to see her dad on Sundays. And so there is a definitive point in time where that family unit is no longer configured in the way that it used to be. And yet at the same time, the consequence of that break continues to iterate throughout the course of her life in these various ways. And I don't want to say too much about how it manifests in that way, to not have any spoilers. But it's something I can certainly relate to, as well, from my own personal experience, of having parents who separated when I was young. And I think that Aline does a very good job of having it be such that the book isn't a book of blame. It is a book of telling just the reality of what happens and how it continues to be a choreography, um, for the remainder of all of the parties' lives, as a relationship to each other evolves and changes with time. And for some people, in some situations, they stay stuck in that initial break, and how their positioning then creates additional tension because the other people have moved on, or have, or are trying to, right? Trying to move away from this initial focal point to be able to grow into something else. And that's something that Aline struggles with, to be able to define herself by something else. And so she talks about, well, I'm saying Aline, but the narrator of this fictional book, talks about leaving the house and getting her own job for the first time, and the freedom that that gives her, and the creation of a space to define herself that isn't based on this endless series of goodbyes, right? Within her family, the one goodbye that continues through the course of her life, and then the continuous smaller goodbyes of, saying goodbye to her mom and saying goodbye to her dad as she goes to visit each of them. And I mentioned before that this book is written in the style of an epic poem, or a long form poem. And one of the things that additionally makes it unique is that Aline also plays around with font size and font structure. And this is something I've been noticing more and more in books that I've been reading. And it reminded me in particular of another book that I read recently that was quite fabulous, called Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer. Maddie Mortimer is a British author. And again, her book is called Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies. And that is a book that chronicles the journey of her family. It's a fictional account, but in that book of chronicling the process of her family dealing with the grief of her mother's death. And in Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies, Maddie Mortimer plays heavily with font size, font, not coloring, but bolding and italicizing, and even just the positioning of the words and letters on the page is incredibly unique. I hadn't seen a book like that before. And yet now reading Pequena Coreografia do Adeus from a completely unrelated author, Aline Bei from Brazil, it was reminiscent of that. And I love this, I guess, increasingly accepted and common trend to, break the mold of a traditional paragraph structure and traditional page layout structure, to be able to use the placement of the words and font size and other things to be able to communicate what you want to. Like, it's creating these various additional layers of communication and meaning. To provide a concrete example, in this book, Choreografia, Pequena Coreografia do Adeus, one of the uh, traits of the book that Aline uses is that she will put in a smaller font from the main font something that for the reader can be understood to either be something that the narrator is whispering to herself, or is an internal thought. of the narrator. And so rather than, bracketing or, putting that language into quotes and then having some explanatory phrase that's like, she whispered, comma, open quotes, blah, 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 close quotes. Instead, it'll just have whatever it is that she has said in a smaller font and sometimes within parentheses. I know that was super nerdy, but I'm fascinated by that. And I think it's also hard to visualize as I'm just explaining it rather than, you being able to see it for yourself. But I think it's beautiful. And I think I've been working on my own book for a while, and I'm continuing to talk about it as a way of self accountability. And I'm inspired by this model of now these couple of books. There are more books. As I was mentioning, this is a trend I'm seeing. Those are just a couple of examples, both Pequena Coreografia do Adeus by Aline Bei and Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer that um, that come to mind in terms of this experimentation with layout and form and using that not just for the sake of experimentation, but it actually translates different meaning. As I'm reading this book and I see the smaller font, it's almost like it provokes this physical sensation for you to also make yourself smaller. Like you're sitting there reading the book and then you read the smaller words, and it's almost like I have this involuntary reaction to kind of curl in my shoulders and get smaller myself as I'm digesting what is meant to be whispered or what is meant to be an internal thought. And I think it's brilliant, and it's something that I am keeping in mind as I'm trying to work on my own writing, to not just use the words themselves, but the actual format of the words to convey meaning. And, for my job, I do a lot of writing. And it's funny that the format of the writing matters a lot. And it is to enhance communication or clarity of communication to whoever my audience is, which is typically a court. And each court has its own rules about format and layout. And sometimes there are even rules regarding what fonts you can use. There are often rules about what size font you can use. A lot of courts will require 12-point font, but there are other courts that require 14-point font, for example, and spacing requirements and things like that. And so it's just interesting. It just caused reflection to me about the fact that my professional writing, legal writing, has also uses format and structure as a mechanism for conveying meaning, more so to make it easy on the audience to be able to digest the information, and yet how that can translate as well into the literary space to be able to communicate meaning. And in legal writing, it's quite rare for you to be able to even use our basic tools of emphasis or distinguishing, such as italics or bolding or underlining, to be able to emphasize certain words or phrases. And that's certainly something that I've done. But it is still limited, and you have to use it quite sparingly, right? Because then it loses the point of being able to emphasize something if everything is emphasized. Anyway, this is getting very nerdy, but I think that Pequena Coreografia do Adeus is a beautiful book. It is quite painful book. It is a story about family, and it is a story about loss, and it is a story about finding happiness in a different configuration of not only yourself but of your family, and told in a really unique way, in an ongoing poem format that you don't necessarily feel like you're reading a poem, and yet that because there is this break in the structure and it's not traditional paragraphs, and there is a lot of space, both in terms of physical white space on the page, but also in terms of just filling in the details of what is going on. It creates this very different emotional reaction, and I think it's quite beautiful, and I'm quite impressed and quite inspired um, by this novel and how it is able to transmit human emotions with um, with less. So I'm quite grateful for that, and I hope that it will eventually be translated into English. Though that is, I mean, poetry is translated all the time, so I know that this is not impossible. But I do think that that adds an additional element of challenge of how you would translate that, because again, the actual layout and formatting are part of the message that's being conveyed. And as we know, right, the length of words, the flow of words is different from language to language. So how do you maintain fidelity to the original meaning and conveyance of something that is so based on layout and formatting when you're changing into a different language that you don't control the number of syllables or letters that are in the corresponding word in another language. I do some voluntary translation work, but I'm not a professional translator, and I'm sure there's lots of literature out there about this and the unique challenge that that presents to be able to, yeah, faithfully convey meaning through translation. Anyway, it's a lot of random thoughts, but that is today's book report. Pequena Coreografia do Adeus by Aline Bei, Brazilian author. I recommend it, and I will speak with you next time. Thanks so much for listening.